Welcome back to our study. We're going to continue. Last study, we looked briefly at the destruction of in fact, quite a bit of detail, the destruction of the temple that Jesus predicts, how it must have shocked the disciples, and yet those who were here reading the gospel, or to whom the gospel was being read in those days, they wouldn't have read it, would have been read in their places of worship, and everybody would have heard it being read to them. They didn't have Bibles as we did. There was manuscripts sent out and they were read. The people hearing it would have resonated with the truth of what Jesus is saying. Now, it's very important that Matthew includes this prediction about the destruction of Jerusalem, and that the people reading the gospel being read to, hearing the gospel being read to them, would have known about the destruction. The rest deals with further predictions about end time. Not predictions, Jesus speaks about the end times. But he's speaking about it, or it's being recorded and read to the hearers in a context where already they had seen the veracity, the truth of Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple. In other words, what we read here for the hearers would have had a certain urgency to it that we would not have when we read it. So let's move on. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, the outskirts of Jerusalem. We can see here in this image where it is. The Mount of Olives is here in number 11 on the top right-hand corner is the Mount of Olives overlooking the whole of Jerusalem. He goes out there with the disciples. We can see more here. Goes over the bridge just on the top here, on the top of the page, almost at the corner there, top middle. There's a bridge there. Goes over that bridge to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples take Jesus on about what he said earlier about the destruction of the temple. They say to him, or we'll get on to that. Before we move on to what Jesus said, we need to understand something very briefly. We need to explore the Jewish concept of the day of the Lord. The Jews divided all time into two ages. There was the present age, there was the age to come. The present age was wholly bad, beyond any kind of human reformation, redemption. It could only be mended by the direct intervention of God. And when God came to intervene, the golden age would come into being and would have arrived. But between these two ages, this present totally bad age and the golden age to come, there would be the day of the Lord, which would be a time of terrible and fearful upheaval, the birth pangs of a new age. Now, an essential part of Jewish thinking on the future was the day of the Lord. And the New Testament, later New Testament writers identified it as a second coming of Christ. That was the day when God would directly intervene in history, when the present age with all its incurable evil would be transformed into the age to come. The New Testament authors took over all that imagery, which had to do with the day of the Lord, and applied it to the second coming of Christ. So in the Old Testament, it presents a whole lot of very diverse images of the day of the Lord. And Jewish apocalyptic literature between the Old and New Testament intertestamental period developed these images into a very vivid and even terrible manner. Certain elements, and we're only looking at some of the elements of it, were there. It would be a time of terror. Zephaniah 1:14-18 speaks of the day of wrath, a day of distress, a day of anguish, a day of ruin, or devastation, darkness and gloom, clouds and thick darkness. becomes stunningly. Paul actually grasped this concept. Thessalonians, the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. The rabbis had a saying that 3 things are sudden: the coming of the Messiah, the discovery, and a scorpion. Found it quite interesting, particularly the scorpion part. Third, the universe, it would be cosmic in its dimensions. The universe would be shattered to pieces, and nature itself would act contrary to herself. The sun and moon would be darkened. Everything in nature would fall into commotion and confusion. The sun would appear at night, the moon by day. Isaiah 13 says the sun will be turned into darkness, the moon into blood. Joel also speaks of that. But it also would be a time of moral chaos and upheaval and violence and hatred. And that would be the norm of life, the atmosphere of life. Among people, restraints of order would be dissolved. Sin and ungodliness would rule upon the earth. Men would fight against each other. Friend would fight against friend. The son would against the father. The daughter against the mother. Nations would rise up against nations. And to this conflict, worldly human conflict, would be added earthquakes, fires, famines. Swords would appear in heaven. Trains of horses and footmen would march through the clouds. Blood would trickle from wood. Stones would give voice, would speak. And places that had been sown would appear as unsown. Full barns would be found empty. The springs of wells would be stopped. In Matthew, we find another dimension. Jesus adds a persecution to which the followers of Christ will have to endure, and we're going to come to these passages now. Matthew 24 adds a threat which would develop against the life and purity of the church. Matthew 24, 13, 14, 27 speak directly of a second coming of the Messiah. So now, with this rough background, let's just look at this vision in more detail. It may take more than one session. And I'm not taking the passages consecutively here, but I'm taking the passages which deal with each strand. So it's not going to be consecutive. So you may want to just pause here and read Matthew 24, 3 to 51 for a few moments before we carry on. So just pause the recording and read it, and then you can click carry on once you've finished pausing it. Okay, as we look further at this, we want to keep starkly in mind the persecuted Jewish Christians living in the Galilee area to whom Matthew is writing. Particularly pertinent as we read these words is that if we date this letter to the period post the Jewish uprising against the Romans and the subsequent siege and destruction of Jerusalem, then parts of it would have already happened. And the Christians hearing this being read to them would identify aspects of it already as having happened. Very important to remember that this is written to people. How they heard it being read is particularly important to our interpretation of it. So they're sitting in the Mount of Olives. The disciples say to him, when will this happen? In private, in other words, there's nobody else around. And what will happen to show us that the time is for your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus goes on. And this is quite a substantial section, so we're going to take it up from. And Jesus answers, watch out and don't let anyone fool you. Many men claiming to speak for me will come and say, I'm the Messiah, and they will fool many people. But you're going to hear the noise of battles close by and the news of battles far away. Interestingly, hear the noise close by and get the news of battles far away. But do not be troubled. Such things must happen, but if they do not mean that the end has come. Countries will fight against each other, kingdoms will attack one another, there will be famines and earthquakes everywhere. These are like the first pains of childbirth. In other words, they're not birth or birth itself. These are the things that precede what is going to happen. And interesting, and I want to take this into direction of the church, the early church. And into the direction that Matthew has included this deliberately to highlight two dangers that Jesus saw would threaten the church. In other words, the church that he is writing it to is experiencing these dangers. There would be danger of false leaders who would seek to propagate their own agendas, desires for power, and interpretation of truth, rather than the truth as it is in Jesus Christ. The inevitable result of false leaders always is the spreading of division instead of building up unity. And the test of any leader is likeness to Christ and the ability to build up unity around the truth. It's not what they teach, it's not what they say. It is who they are as people. And who they are as people needs to speak far louder than anything they say. The test of any leader is that the ability to build up unity around the truth and the greater good and cohesion of the whole is very important. And we must always remember that. Second danger is that of discouragement. There are those whose love will grow cold because of the increasing lawlessness of the world. There are people who say to me, if I look at the world in which we live, I cannot believe. That's par for the course. The true Christian is a person who holds to his belief when belief is at its most difficult. And in the most discouraging circumstances, refuses to believe that God's power has grown less. Jesus continues, then you will be arrested and handed over to be punished and put to death. They would have experienced this. This was after the martyrdom of Stephen and all of it. Everyone will hate you because of me. Many will give up their faith at that time. They will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will appear and fool many people. And such will be the spread of evil that people's love will grow cold. But whoever holds out to the end will be saved. And this good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout all the world for a witness to all people. And then the end will come. Jesus is warning those early Christians he's writing to that they have to be prepared to walk in those difficult times. It's a real prediction. The day ahead of, I don't know how many believers and followers of Christ in the last 2,000 years. But those who are hearing the gospel being read to them in their local assemblies would have already known the faith stories of Jews like the disciples and Paul who had been threatened. They would have known those stories. They would have known of Paul being beaten and imprisoned, Peter being imprisoned, Stephen being martyred. It would have happened in their lifetime. They would have known of those imprisoned for their faith by the Jewish authorities in cities that preached and evangelized them. They, more than likely, would have experienced, in fact, not more than likely, inevitably experienced some form of persecution for their faith. In fact, it could be strongly argued that many in this community of faith had been isolated, ostracized, and persecuted by their own Jewish families. They were Jews who had become Christians, and some of them had been forced to live in caves because they had been kicked out of their homes for their faith. I suspect Matthew is deliberately including this teaching of Jesus to encourage those already being persecuted. And he's giving them the realization that Jesus knew what they were going to experience and they were experiencing. And he spoke about it. The bottom line for you and I is that Jesus never promised his disciples an easy road, but the way of being at radical odds with the ways, thinking, and desires of the world. The result would be a real church would always be a persecuted church, as long as it exists in a world which is not a Christian world. The reasons behind this. Christ calls for a loyalty that above all other loyalties entitles you to him, his truth and his way. The consequence is that there will always be a clash with others over contesting claims of loyalty, even those closest to us. The Christian is on his pledge to give Jesus Christ the first place in his life. And many clashes are liable to result from that. And second, Christ calls his followers to a new way and standard. These ways are at odds with the customs and practices and ways of life which may seem right for the world, but are far from being right for a Christian. For many people, the difficulty about Christianity is that it is a judgment upon themselves. You may not judge others, but what you stand for as a believer is a judgment upon how others live their life. When you see a beggar and you reach out to talk to them and give them something, you have judged simply by your actions those who refuse to do anything and say, yeah, they must go and find work. And they say that in the context where they know that employment is so high. The reality is that for many people, the difficulty about Christianity is that there's a judgment upon themselves, their way of life, their way of doing business, and their personal relationships. Have you ever told a businessman that he needs to tithe? Jews do. Look at the response. The Christian needs, you and I need to realize that the way of life we've been called to is diametrically opposed to the way of life of the world. We're called to both and think and behave differently to the thinking and belief of the world. The reality of thinking, believing, and living and doing differently to the world around us is that it's not only opposed to that of will, but simply by what we think and do, challenges and opposes the world. We will be rejected for it. The early church was rejected by the Jewish and Roman authorities and the world, and there was an attempt to destroy it. Let's check our time on this. Okay, let's stop it here and on 24:15 and continue in our next study with it. I don't like making our studies too long.